Yeah, before Agnes and David start, could I just remind people to mute their mics if possible? Thank you.
Can I start?
Yeah, on you go.
Oh, sorry, I was waiting for some green light or something.
Oh, sorry, I should have.
That's all right. I hope you can see my. Can you see my?
Comparing over who was doing what there. No, on you go, Agnes, whenever you're ready. Sorry, I do apologise.
That's all right. Hello everyone. Great to have you at this event. David and I are going to talk about, as you can see up there, hopefully this slide, emergent research themes in local media and journalism and their implications for journalism education. This presentation came out from the book Margaret just mentioned, which David and I edited and came out last April, and you can see the cover there, Routledge Companion to Local Media and Journalism. Oh, sorry, I thought someone was asking me a question. And in terms of what the companion is about is, well, hopefully it's sort of self-evident, but what we're trying to do is to give a comprehensive survey of current research into local media and journalism to date, but from a truly global perspective. So make sure that all continents are covered in the book and different perspectives. And nearly, I think there's more than 30 countries sort of case studies offered. The book contains 46 chapters written by 66 authors from 21 countries. So we really, that sort of international element we try to bring in, and in different sort of perspectives. The book also has a 12,000 word introduction written by David and myself, which we aim to offer a theoretical contribution to the field. Providing definition of some key concepts, but also identify some key themes and areas for further research, partially from the review from the contribution of the book, but also more widely of the field itself. So in this presentation, what we will try to do is to talk about 8 themes which we identified as part of this work, and some of the implications for journalism education. I'm going to talk about 4 of the themes, and then David will take over and then finish with the other 4. And we think it's quite important also to consider these themes, not just in relation to local media and journalism research, but also in relation to education, given that so many of our students go into local journalism or into organizations working with local media and journalism, and also the given fact that to what extent the great sort of transformation of the whole sector. So in terms of, let's look at the themes. So one of the themes we identify is a need for greater theorizations in the field, and that sort of illustrates also a quote from Chris Anderson's from the book, that arguably in the past, so a lot of the literature in the field tend to be sort of focused on the current environment, on ongoing local journalism developments, and arguably sort of lost a little bit of the sort of the intellectual structure for the field as a whole. And examples we give in the book is that sort of some lack of lack of consensus regarding the meaning of some of the key terms and terminology. For example, the community journalism means quite a different thing in the US context than, for example, here. So this sort of theme sort of is a call for a more greater theorization and sort of a greater consensus regarding some of the key terms and terminology, which arguably would also help students to understand some of the great changes of what the sector is going through. For example, what is actually local journalism in a digital online environment. The second, another theme we identified as part of this review and work is the need for a more comparative approach to study of local, and I would argue also to teach local media and journalism. Again, historically, a lot of the work tended to focus on specific context, whether it's a national context or one region or even one outlet, and that's understandable because of the nature of the field, but also the need for in-depth sort of insights. But I think the review sort of shows, and also I think that with the current sort of digital sort of changes in online environment, that more comparative approach does bring great advantages and benefits for understanding of the sector and the changes it's going through, both for research and journalism education. And to illustrate that, I put a quote up on the slides from Bloomer and Gorovich, sort of identifying that one of the key advantages indeed is the comparative analysis ability to render the invisible visible, to identify, to question the taken for granted and what is difficult to detect when the focus is only on one case studies. And there's quite a few examples in the book how a comparative approach actually helps to understand certain aspects in the field. Another thing which we identified as part of this work is and the need for a more nuanced consideration for sustainability. Now, sustainability has become quite sort of interest in research. Interest in sustainability has increased quite considerably in the last, especially 5 years. And you could see actually from the contributions in the book as well, there's a number of chapters which are about sustainability of specific media organizations or indeed specific local media ecologies. And the focus on sustainability, however, what it aspires is that often is on revenue models and income patterns of individual media organizations. And I think also there is a sort of a bit of an echo in journalism education, that there has been an interest in making sure that students have a good grasp of the industry, how it works, and some of the business models. However, as a bit lengthy quote in that slide to illustrate, we found that as part of this review that sustainability needs to be sort of considered a more nuanced way, and not just about the considerations of the different revenue models or financial sustainability. What we found is that actually, yes, financial sustainability of local media organization is an issue in many parts of the world, but the picture has been more complex. So it's not actually a universal pattern necessarily. And indeed, the research also sort of showed in a number of cases that apart from financial stability, or on top of financial stability, what also has been critical was actually the willingness and the ability of a community to support local media and the strength of the wider local media ecosystem. And that actually echoed also another quote from Reader and Hatchett, was also from a chapter from the book, who argued that exactly sort of similarly, that actually that community service, which was actually a key aspect for sustainability for local media organizations. So we would argue that actually it's really important that both research and journalism education should be considered as a more nuanced consideration for sustainability. Fourthly, we also identified a theme regarding a call for more insights into local media gaps. Now, historically, obviously, local media research as well as journalism education probably focused on, you know, what is there, not what's not there. But in the last few years, there has been an increase in research on local news deserts. There are a number of chapters in the book which looks at that topic in different country contexts. There's an interesting article in Brazil, for example, and regarding local news gap there, as well as in Australia and in the United States. So our review and the various contributions show that there are significant variations, with some places experiencing increasing local news deserts and showing increasing number of communities with no or limited local news provisions. And this research also showed that there are significant spatial inequalities when it comes to local media and news provisions and consumptions. And often that these variations actually linked to wider social inequalities. Philip Napoli actually chapter is quite an interesting one, looking at how this local news deserts actually linked to wider sort of social inequalities. So I think we argue that it's quite an important that that there's more research done in this area, so more insights in local media gaps, but also that students understand these spatial inequalities regarding not just local, but news provisions in more general, and the implications of these, and that's the quote which tries to illustrate that actually is obviously there's the implications of these local media gaps and in regarding provision of news, but also in regarding emergence of so-called democratic deficit and the different aspects of that. But beyond that, also actually regarding what actually implications on the community and the life of the community as a whole. And I'll hand it over to David at this point.
Thank you, Agnes. Thank you. Historical perspectives. Our focus in journalism education so often naturally on what's happening now and what is emerging to shape the future of those fields in which our graduates will be working. But understanding what's happened in the past can give us a firmer grip on journalism, what's happening journalism today, and on those new directions. Agnes has spoken about the importance of unpacking taken for granted concepts and practices, and understanding how local media arrived where they are today can help us to do this. Rachel Matthews, in her chapter, demonstrates that in Britain, despite the often taken for granted role and self-identification of the journalist as the deliverer of a public benefit and the servant of a public interest, the local press has always been a hard-nosed commercial endeavour, and that has shaped and informed traditional journalism practices. Around the world today, local TV news programmes follow a recognised formula: 2 news anchors, weather person, sports person. But this was not always so, and local news was not always a big deal on local and regional TV. Madeleine Lieseblad traces what she terms the peopleization of news to a consultancy-led set of innovations at one small station in the 1960s. The formula developed for KYW of Philadelphia has shaped taken for granted local TV journalism practices for generations of professionals around the world. Elias Skogabo shows how out of Norway's widely scattered communities grew a journalism that valued diversity and locality, and which was shaped by a strong welfare impetus in the development of communication structures and systems. And these cultural factors produced a sector that has been able to weather the financial storms of the last decade comparatively successfully in that nation. And some of the current tentative cultural shift, which we are seeing towards a primary focus on public interest and sustainability rather than commercial success and profitability, a shift that has taken place in many places around the world, could learn from the history of local journalism and how it developed, what worked well, what less well in Britain, the United States, Norway, and beyond. And next on to accelerating collaboration. Collaborations. Journalism is traditionally a competitive field, and we tend to assess our students individually and in a competitive context, and they moan when they're faced with group assignments anyway. But journalism is increasingly a collaborative process. Journalists working with other journalists, look at the Panama Papers, WikiLeaks, the Snowden revelations. Journalists with other professionals, such as coders and data processors, with other stakeholders, particularly within their communities. Jan Boyles explores many of these new dynamics as she examines the manner in which local news media in the United States are partnering with local non-profits civic technologists and philanthropic foundations to address shared societal concerns by, and I quote, collectively engaging the local community. And Tony Harcup, who spoke at last week's AG symposium and is here today, demonstrates how alternative local media in Britain have always approached media work as active participative citizenship. So on to issues of power and politics. As we look to rebuild socially, culturally, economically from the pandemic, it's important that we learn from our localities and communities what they need, rather than those in power simply deciding whose interests to favour, what those needs are and how they are to be met. We need to prepare young journalists to amplify the voices of communities, and particularly the voices of marginalised groups and those who generally go unheard. And that maps onto what Agnes was saying a moment ago about news gaps. Florian Meissner and Jun Tsudoka look at the role local journalists play in Japan in their investigation into disaster reporting. And they find that when the national lens has moved on from the immediate crisis, the flood, the tsunami, the earthquake, it's the local journalist who persists, who doesn't allow the local, regional, national government to neglect the long recovery process. Chris Anderson, reporting in the USA, warns of the rise of fake news and populism as a less local, mogul-owned media, which is prey to political interests, retreats from the local scene and localities, local landscape. And Ilya Kiria in Russia points to the retreat into irrelevancy of a local media in the pay of politicians. In a recent incident in Britain highlights that danger, with a chief reporter on a newspaper where I started my career, the Evening Mail in Barrow-in-Furness, having to flee from the town with her 5-year-old daughter because of death threats from local racists accusing her of covering up sexually predatory gangs, gangs which the local police found to be non-existent. On to issues of regulations and subsidies. And okay, this crackles with dryness. You can almost hear the patter of students' feet flocking from this module. But issues relating to regulation and policy formation profoundly determine whether we have local media or not, and if we do, what kind we have. Christopher Ali provides a close analysis of the way in which once prized localism principles were gradually written out of communication policy in the United States and the dire consequences that has had for local TV there. In Spain, Aida Montsant demonstrates that the manner in which digital terrestrial television was introduced wiped out at a stroke vibrant community TV channels that had grown up in the analog era. But Rose Kimani shows how regulators in Kenya are demanding that broadcasters demonstrate real engagements with their local communities. And in regard to subsidies, Shailendra Singh, writing about journalism in the Pacific Islands, echoes Francis Cairncross's plea in Britain for public funding for a public benefit. However, Ele Skogobo and Gunnar Nygren point to the marginal benefits from public support in, respectively, Norway and Sweden in terms of fostering startups and increasing the diversity and plurality of the local media. Maria Terega and Josep Guimera warn that in the case of subsidies for Catalan language media in northeast Spain, there are almost no impartial actors. And in France, Mathieu Lardeau finds that an extensive subsidy system has fostered monopoly rather than diversity and plurality, and the local media tied to, rather than challenging, local power. So, in conclusion, and for our graduates as they go on to shape careers, an ability to think strategically and apply critical theory is as important as skills and knowledge. A broad perspective of the field and the ability to identify and analyse the taken for granted and thus invisible. A more nuanced notion of concepts of sustainability, where the gaps lie and why. An understanding of the local context is critical, of what shaped it, of the collaborative relationships and networks in place, the regulatory framework moulding the local media and landscape. And thank you, that's where we close. And our final slide has a full set of those references.
Fantastic, thank you, David and Agnes, really interesting. And I know we're going to have questions at the end, but I'm really interested in the notion of community and how, and we can maybe explore that, you know, that how do we define it? How do we, you know, when so many sort of aspects of community have been eroded, how do we how do we identify that notion of community and also the notion of agency that can come with community? And I don't know if that's something you looked at, but I think that's something that's really important in the context of enabling people to have voices and therefore agency in their communities. Fantastic, thank you. So next up we have, I think Paul's up next, yeah? So Paul is looking at engaging with communities through the use of analytics. And Paul, you should be able to share your slides if you've got them. Yeah.
I'll just be 2 seconds.
Yeah, that's okay. Just take your
time. Just need to find me right bit of this. Move this up here. This should be in business.
Yeah.
Just start. I don't want to start at the end. That's not a good idea. I'll get to the right bit and then I'll start there. Yeah. So this is, I suppose, a little bit different in that this is talking about developing digital communities, and the reason that I submitted it was because I'd made some changes in a module that I was teaching, and I was really quite interested in what had occurred when I did it. So yeah, my name's Paul Marsden. I'm a senior lecturer at Leeds Trinity University. If you can see a picture of me on the screen, that's what I look like when I've not had a lockdown haircut. I know that a lot of you will already know quite a bit about Leeds Trinity University, but for those of you that don't, we are a very kind of practice-based university. Our key selling point is that our graduate level employment rate, that's something that's really, really important to us, because we are a widening participation university. So we do often take learners from quite a low baseline at post 18 and focus on building the skills that employers tell us that they need in their newsrooms, because obviously that's quite important for making sure that we're kind of performing our role as a university, really. You know, a lot of our students are coming in sometimes with BTEC qualifications rather than A-level qualifications increasingly. So we need to make sure that we're giving them what they're looking for from us, really. So a key thing in understanding the course that I'm talking about, so I'm talking about sports journalism students, is that we have a kind of core set of employers that a lot of our graduates will go and work for. So these are three kind of prime examples of that. So in Leeds, there's the Planet Sport Group that we work quite closely with, and their flagship brand is a company called Football 365, which has been running for, I think, around 20 years. And they basically try to get as much online engagement in their website as possible. So I think they're looking at about 80 million page views a month for their website. We have quite a lot of our students who work with them while they're doing the degree, and quite a lot of our graduates who then go on and work for them afterwards. Another core employer for us is a company called Perform, who do content for the Mail Online, Opta, Stats Perform, an organisation called The Zone used to be part of Perform as well, who do something called the Netflix of sport, so buying up sports rights around Europe. And one of our other key employers is football and sports clubs generally. So our graduates have gone and worked for Newcastle United, Reading, Doncaster Rovers, Huddersfield Town, Lincoln City, Featherstone Rovers in Rugby League. One of our graduates is a Sheffield Wednesday reporter on the Sheffield Star, and another one is the Leeds United reporter on the Yorkshire Evening Post. And what all those organisations are looking for is the ability for our students to be able to engage online, create sporting content, have really good social media skills and be able to engage with their audience on those platforms, and the ability to really get people to come in and look at the content that they're looking for, because obviously a lot of these organisations are either relying on advertising or wanting to, they've got a kind of core audience base that they're working with. And so that kind of possibly explains a little bit about what I'm going to talk about now, which is I took on a course I took on a module within the course which was a second year 40 credit module, which was suffering from some kind of patchy attendance, low engagement and poor timekeeping at various points. But I knew these guys were really passionate about sport because they tell me all the time, they're constantly talking about their passion for it. So I thought, well, I want to kind of test them in terms of what they're talking about and kind of really try and motivate them. So now in the second semester of the module, I've split the class into 2 groups of a similar academic standard, and I've tried to do that through looking at their marks in the first semester, and also the fact that I've taught them, so I have a good understanding of hopefully what they're like, and kind of put them in competition with each other to hopefully try and drive up the standards of the work and the effort that they're putting into things. And I've provided a bit of structure within that. So it is a 10-week module, and I've given them 2 weeks to try and kind of find their feet at the start. You know, give them a chance to build these social media platforms that they may need, to build the website that they're going to work on, give them lots of support to do that. But after that, the groups are marked weekly, and both groups are told their mark at the start of the following week's session. And the main thing that I'm telling them all the time, coming back to this sense of community, is that they need to develop a digital community. They need to find an audience. And one of the ways that I'm trying to reinforce with them, and I think one of the more interesting things that came out of what we've been doing with them, is going back to them every week with their analytics for each group, talking to them about their reach on different platforms and social media, and kind of coming back to them with questions and saying to them, right, how are we going to solve this? How are you going to work through this? But also within that, not ignoring the fact that we know, I think, as journalists, that sometimes really good journalism isn't rewarded by the audience. So ensuring that within that, you don't just kind of blindly go with the numbers. You know, you're giving a bit of a boost to somebody who's written something that was fantastic or produced something that's fantastic that just hasn't gone rewarded particularly well. Or saying to them, you just haven't promoted this right. You've done something that's really good, but you just need to think about how you're doing it. And I suppose I would hope in that way that I'm scaffolding the teaching a bit and trying to give them as much positive feed forward as possible, a bit like you would do in a news conference, kind of saying to them, right, this is the situation we're in, this is what you need to kind of prioritize looking ahead. And hopefully there is some underpinning theory, and I think this would be it really. And I've given each group an editor who's also got some deputies within that. And one of the kind of things that I'm kind of prioritizing with that is that there's someone with high personal motivation, organization, but also quite good communication skills. So what I'm in essence person I'm hopefully putting in charge is someone who's a self-regulated learner. But I'm also saying to the student, you don't have to stick with this structure. This is just how I want you to start. And I think that's quite important because self-regulated learners tend to seek their challenges. They're able to set goals and plan, and they're really able to kind of drive things forward in the kind of way that you would normally see of a senior journalist in a newsroom. And what I'm really wanting to try and do is develop more of these self-regulated learners as they go into the final year of the degree, as they go into their placements that they've got in the second year. But I've also kind of realised as I've gone along that these self-regulated learners are going to require some autonomy. So they're going to want to decide what, when, where, and how they're going to learn and how they're going to put things together. So although I will kind of stand there at the beginning and tell them their scores, or do it online at the moment, I'm then trying to become a bit more of a facilitator as the session goes on rather than a lecturer. So someone who gives them the freedom to do what they want, will support what they're trying to achieve in a technical sense, will be a sounding board if they want me to, but I want them to solve the problems rather than me, because there's no point me doing it and I might not come up with the right answers anyway. So I suppose what I'm really trying to do is that the editor and the kind of people that are driving that project forward are hopefully going to be providing the intrinsic motivation. And I suppose I'm going to be kind of providing the external motivation, hopefully, for the rest of the group through the metrics. So the fact that they can see the figures on the site, they know about the content and the amount of content that they're producing. And the big burning thing that gets everybody enraged with me every single week, the grade that it attracts and how have you come to that and all of that. Because that, I suppose, as we all know, is the thing that students really get fired up about. But to ensure that you've got a kind of an evidence of external motivation running throughout, hopefully, there is some peer marking involved to try and make sure that some people involved in the project can't just coast. So it can be shifted around the marking due to the perceived input of everybody who's involved in that group. Although I do kind of put a bit of a caveat in there because I don't want them just to pick on somebody and, you know, really do them down for no reason. So I do say that to them, but luckily I've not needed to bring that into it. So really the challenge as it is to develop a community of readers, reaching them, bringing them into the site, and then trying to get them to return. The kind of challenge that everybody in journalism faces. And building this over time while producing the content that has some journalistic merit. So saying to them, I don't just want you to bring loads and loads of numbers, there has to be some meaning behind it and you have to stand for something. But obviously, like every form of journalism, there does need to be an audience and you do need to build this community there. And hopefully one of the side effects of that is that they create a journalistic portfolio to increase their chances of employment going forward. So this is kind of, I suppose, one part of the results that I can kind of talk about. I had two groups who did this last year and kind of had two slightly different approaches and two slightly different outcomes, in that one of the groups was kind of really good every week at making steps forward, and we were able to get to over 16,000 page views in 8 weeks, which I thought was relatively impressive. Especially as towards the back end of it, we kind of started hitting COVID and the start of the lockdown. The other group found it more difficult. The dynamic probably wasn't as positive within them. And it gave me some different challenges to try and solve and work with. But they still produced some good stuff. They just weren't able to promote it in the same manner. But one of the things that I have found quite interesting going into this year and starting this again is that the motivation of the students, if anything, is higher at the moment. And I'm kind of really seeing them kind of stepping it on a level from what I saw last year, which I don't know if that means I'm doing it in a different way or this cohort's just particularly on it in terms of this, but it's quite impressive. And I think one of the things that I've managed to observe from doing this is that the competition quite often spurs on the progress, because they know that they've got to reach an audience. They try new things to quite often inspire each other. So one of the things that I found sometimes is students sometimes think that social media promotion is a bit of an afterthought, but when you put their grade and their pride involved in it, it suddenly becomes a much bigger thing for them, and the productivity seems to go into overdrive, and they learn from looking at what each of them are doing. So this example here on the right is taken from one of the stories that one of them did about rugby league and rugby league rivalries, and they put it into a rugby league fan group on Facebook, and it got 70 comments and 12 shares and brought in about 2,000 people into the website. And I think that what they managed to learn from that was that the way social media works. So if you write a story that's involving people's pride in their community, in terms of their local community and their team, or something you've written something that angers them in terms of sporting coverage, sometimes that does drive engagement. How positive that engagement always is obviously a bit of an issue, but they kind of learned from that a bit about audiences, which is quite important, I think. What also seemed to happen is that you had developing formats and the production values kept increasing. So this is just a very quick example of something that started off as a quiz with one camera in the studio and ended up with 2 cameras, several days of editing. And obviously this isn't the TV module, so this is something that they decided to drive forward on their own.
That is, I'm going to be so bad at this, I can tell already. The sound did not want to do it, but it didn't go down so well.
So that's just the start of it, but like I say, my background's not in television. I was only really able to give them limited support in this, but they kind of really decided that this is the route they wanted to go down, and kind of pushed it forward and really developed the kind of content that they were producing. Let's see if I can get to the next one. And they also started expanding into new platforms as well. So this year's group had already spent quite a lot of time investing in the idea of watch-alongs on YouTube, and they decided to do something I would have never suggested, which was a 12-hour watch-along on YouTube around the transfer deadline day earlier this month. And it was a bit ridiculous to kind of see the level of engagement that they managed to attract, and they ended up with 21,500 people watching it on YouTube. So, and the kind of comments that they got as well. So it really kind of shows, I suppose, how some of them, through kind of being creative and approaching things in their own way, can really drive stuff forward. Obviously, things have been a little bit different this time anyway, because everything's online, but I suppose the shift to online only has actually been fairly seamless for this module, because it's primarily production rather than me telling them things. And the challenge appears to have given the students a focus in lockdown, which is great, because the production and productivity is very high, and they're getting increasingly inventive. The attendance has also been really impressive. And I suppose one of the other key things that I've picked up on is the fact that they've started being much more strategic in terms of the communities that they're targeting. So the Sports Corner group at the bottom there decided they were going to target African football fans as an audience, because they felt that they were someone that weren't getting particularly well served through a lot of the existing coverage in terms of sport. So that they've started kind of thinking about how they're going to serve that community a bit more. And this is probably the thing that gives me the most pride, I suppose. This is a student who left about a year ago, Connor, and he kind of set off on his own project in a similar kind of vein in his final year, and managed to hit 100,000 website hits through less than 50 articles. And I suppose the thing with this is that he's really passionate about what he's doing, and I suppose it's fantastic to see, even though he's graduated, he's kept what he was doing in his final year going, and really kind of pushed it forward, and hopefully it's helping him with his career as he goes forward. So in conclusion to that, I think what I've ended up doing with the second year students has helped to develop more self-regulated students. So I am seeing an improvement as they go into the final year when I'm teaching them in there. They do appear to have an increase in awareness of online communities and how they can be engaged, which I think is really positive. I am seeing an increase in peer-to-peer learning, which I think is always good, rather than it coming from me. Some of the leadership skills that some of the students are developing are really impressive as well, and the way they're relating to each other. And the knowledge around the newsroom analytics, when you link it up with the marking, tends to go through the roof. So they learn more about it, because they can start challenging what I'm saying to them about it. And all of these appear to be quite important when I go back to the beginning of to link to our core focus of employability at Leeds Trinity. I think that's me.
Fantastic, thank you, Paul. Really interesting. I'm really impressed by your success in the peer-to-peer marking. And whenever I've tried that, it's been a complete disaster. So much so now I would absolutely run in the opposite direction of trying to do it again. So I take my hat off to you if you found a way to make it work. Great, thank you so much. And so now to our third paper this afternoon. And we have Dave Harte and Jerome Turner from Birmingham City University, who are going to look at local and global, a pedagogy for reflexive community student journalism. So I shall hand over to Dave and Jerome.
Thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Just give me a second to wait for my computer to do more than two things at once, which is to just kick off the slides and then share screen. Let's see where we are. Okay. Yeah, apologies if you, oh, sharing screen failed to start.
Do you want me, let me just double check. Yeah, it's still set to enable you to share it. So it
Yeah,
should,
yeah, it is. I think it's
just
okay.
exhausted. It's
yeah, it's a laptop in lockdown.
yeah, I think we all know that feeling.
For long, yeah. Oh, I've still got the same error actually. I'm not sure why that would be. You might have to.
Has Jerome maybe got a set of slides that he could share, or do you want to email them to me and I could share them?
Just a second. I'll just try one more time, and then we'll. Okay.
Yeah, that seems to be working now, Dave.
Oh, does it? Okay.
Well, it says that we can see that you've started screen sharing, so there's something happening. Yeah, there we go. We can see them now.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay. Thanks. Good to see some of your faces in the chat, and so nice to see you all again and reconnect. So myself and Jerome are going to talk you through a paper which, just like the previous speaker, actually, Paul, takes you through a module and how that played out and what our approach meant to be. Was meant to be. Well, actually, it is a little bit of meant to be, because I always think when you design curricula modules, you have a kind of perfect idea of how they may play out, but they don't always. So we might touch on that. Myself and Jerome, but I just want to give recognition to a couple of colleagues who helped deliver the module. I did not teach on the module. I'm the person who, the module partly draws on some research myself and Jerome have done around hyperlocal journalism. And I'm the person who said, hey, I think this might make a good paper for the AJE. So that's why I'm here partly. But I'm going to give it some context. So I can see my forwarding of slides is going to be a bit slower than as I click. So firstly, I just want to describe the module. The module's a first year module, and I'm going to talk you through a little bit about what it's meant to do. It's largely a module that is focused on community and local journalism. I want to just situate it in a context around the kind of how UK universities strategically play out their role in the context of global and local communities, and how their priorities flow through to module design. Also touch on some of the issues and contradictions that are in UK journalism education, some competing discourses around how journalism courses pitch themselves, and then we'll get into the meat of running the module. Jerome will tell us a little bit about that. And I just wanted to talk you through an example assessment outcome from the module, which I think was quite interesting. Okay. So the reason to kind of take us back a bit is that when you design courses and design modules, and where I'm in the university, I tend to do a lot of the validation work and that kind of writing course philosophies, that kind of contributions to course design. One of the things you do, and you will be no doubt the same, is you have to say how the course reflects the university's priorities. And colleagues work in universities, I'll be surprised if colleagues worked in a university that didn't have some sense of global priorities, whether that's pitching themselves as the research expertise focused on the global, whether the global is used as a way to attract international students and saying you'll be at home here, you're okay, or international expertise. The global is very much there in strategic priorities. Also, and particularly in new universities, there's a tendency to make connections between the local and global. Certainly universities since the late 90s have had a clearer strategic role in building regional economies and local economies. And Birmingham City is no different. And in fact, for quite a period in the early 2000s, that's what I worked in, the kind of third stream element of universities. So you're constantly making connections between the local and global. This often has something of a neoliberal agenda in universities, that actually it's not so much about connecting to communities, it's offering the community, representing the community as part of its global offer. In Birmingham, the City Council for a long time had a tagline, which was Global City, Local Heart, which was a way of representing its communities in literature and presentations for global investors, international investment conferences, where you'd be flogging a bit of Birmingham land to go and build some high rises. And part of the redevelopment of Birmingham pitch was based around this pitch of we're local, diverse, vibrant, and a good place to place your headquarters. And it works. HSBC built a big headquarters in Birmingham and others came. And so this kind of situating of the local and global works through from the city through the university to curricula. So Gray points out that universities have to play in this space of being a civic, entrepreneurial, innovative, flagship, globally competitive, and both locally and globally engaged. And Patel and Lynch try and turn that into a bit of a positive, saying there's an opportunity for what they call localized learning, in that there's a more careful pedagogy that pays attention to community connectedness in the local, but also draws parallels with community connectedness on the globe as well. So this module comes with that within it. The module is so we can sit in a validation panel and say, we've aligned with the university strategy. Okay. It partly functions to that. That sounds very materialistic, but those of you who've been through a lot of validation panels, this is the kind of discourse you have to play into. So there's a kind of discourse there, which is a little bit neoliberal, but also an attempt in our interpretation of it to offer a kind of a way through that's beneficial for communities. There's also, and I won't dwell on this, I've said this before in presentations, drawing on Sally Reardon's work, there's some kind of, there's kind of discursive contradictions at the heart of journalism education and how you pitch your courses to students, that they are both a kind of a training ground, and you will learn stuff and you will enter an industry where it's bright and innovative, fit for the 21st century. And also a tendency, Reardon argues, in the kind of contrast between, she examined how journalism courses present themselves through web literature, through the publicity. Also a sense that it's something you're born to do rather than learn. And there's this kind of competing discourses in the way courses are presented to students. You can learn it, but it's also a kind of natural ability. So to be really good at it, you've kind of got to be born to do it. But what she points out quite usefully is that there's a lack of presentation of the value of critical thinking. That's often shoehorned into, there's an ethics module, there's a law module, but actually that's rarely foregrounded in the offer to students. So this module is an attempt to deal with the global and local, the localized university, and also to foreground in a concrete way the value of critical thinking. And just to reinforce the point, drawing on again Reardon and some research we've done, we try to bring to this module what we might call a kind of hyperlocal sensibility, which is not just about localness, but in our research we found that hyperlocal publishers, who are often amateurs, not formally trained journalists, tend to be so fiercely defensive of place that it often skewed what they did. They were more interested in banal aspects of living in communities. They came from not journalistic norms, but from citizen-led norms, if you like, that you care about and fiercely defend your place, so where you live so much. So that shifted the way in which the journalism played out. So that's the kind of position we try to start with. Jerome will take us a bit through how that plays out in the context of the module. I hope, unless he's on silent. Jerome?
Hello, sorry, I hadn't unmuted. Yeah, I was one of the three lecturers teaching these groups, and we had about 27 in each group. And one of the approaches to what Dave's been kind of foregrounding here was through a pop-up newsroom. So the pop-up newsroom took place in week 5, and prior to this, we'd covered 2 key ideas to bring up today. So firstly, that the module looks at local, national and global scales of journalism, but that it assumes them to be related. And so we discussed how a local angle to a global crisis or concern could help audiences engage with those ideas. So if it helped them connect via a familiar landmark, or a place, or a community group, or individuals. And then secondly, we stressed the value of being a reporter embedded within a community, so having that same local experience and knowledge. And that class discussion was provoked by exploring, not sure how many people are aware of the 2012 controversy of the journalistic media startup using fake bylines to cover up that local content, or what they were framing as local content for the Chicago Tribune, was being outsourced to freelancers in the Philippines. So that was quite a useful case study to explore that with students. And then it also drew on some of the work, the research projects that I'm involved with being done by pop-up newsroom organisations such as MEDAN, although these are often in a more activist context. So for here, for example, in response to the 2018 Mexican elections, there was a pop-up newsroom space that was dealing with misinformation, disinformation. But in our context, going to Sturchley was about a focused deadline to carry out, and this was in week 5 of 10 weeks of working with the students, to carry out the interviews and gather materials or photos that they needed for their work, but also to experience that locality to kind of help them communicate that. So next slide, please. In the words of Chris Whitty. So prior to the newsroom day, the students were also engaging in desk research, establishing how the organisations they were going to cover and write stories about had been presented and represented online to date. So whether that was through mainstream or hyperlocal news organisations in Birmingham more widely, or through trade publications, or even by themselves on their own social media pages. So the idea being that the students' own work would respond to what they were seeing that currently existed. And what we might need to keep in mind as well is that there's a certain identity that Sturchley was developing. So online, you might imagine a certain hipster vibe, an area in regeneration, teeming with startups. And then kind of when you get there on a rainy day in the winter, it all feels quite different, obviously. So the room we had booked for this newsroom day was in Sturchley Baths, which was an old swimming baths now converted into a community centre. So yeah, when you actually turn up to this place, to run something like a newsroom and get the students walking the streets, it's perhaps less apparent that kind of online identity and something you need to look for. So their work was partly about unearthing these stories from the streets, as it were. Next slide, please. So this is an example of one of our student pieces. So they worked in groups on this module and they created a piece of work which they posted online. But I think the key thing is that the assessment is actually of their 15-minute reflective presentation of this rather than the actual piece of journalism in itself. So this usually took the format of first demonstrating the issues and concerns of the various scales of representation of the type of local organisations they were exploring, before then talking through their process, their piece, and a reflection on the effectiveness of that work and what they felt they learned from that and would carry forward. So here you've got one student group who spoke to various local businesses like cafes. Another did a feature on the global mission work undertaken by the church located on one of the main roads that runs through Sturchley. And that is, an example of a place that local people would pass every day, but without really knowing what went on inside. Next slide, please. And then I suppose it's also worth stressing that within that time frame, we tried to get the students posting their stories in the most appropriate places online, with enough time for these pieces to breathe and for them to observe and comment on the online response. Some of them had used the Sturchley hyperlocal Facebook groups to ask for their initial interviews, and then they used those same places to share the work back into the community. And one group here created a short GIF sting to accompany their work on Twitter for more visibility, essentially. Okay, back to Dave, I think.
Sorry, if you know, if this was on Teams, I'd be like a whiz. You know, 12 months on Teams, I know every shortcut, but Zoom just I'm all over the place. So I thought it'd be worth taking you through. So you can see there that pop-up newsrooms in localities was one of the tools in which we implemented for the module. I thought I'd take you through a student assessment just to show how we kind of how the critical thinking is kind of teased out. So this is an assessment which is about corner shops, and I'll just take you through the process. This is by a couple of students, Libby Stables and Elias Tocco, who allowed us to use their presentation example. So the first thing is that they do a bit of research around this. Around the idea that at the beginning of COVID, because this module took place pre and then at the beginning of COVID during the second semester, and so had to react to circumstances. They spot kind of issues emerging. They start to join in their locality that are working with local Facebook groups and pages, and they see this issue around people getting really cross about price rises in local corner shops. And they think there's a kind of slightly racist element to this, a kind of divisive identification of these shops being owned by particular ethnic groups. So what they do then is they go and do a bit of research about representation of this issue in the mainstream media. And what they find, and they pull on a series of articles, is stuff like this. So this is from the Telegraph early in lockdown, where the Telegraph draw on a kind of nostalgic mediated idea of the corner shop. It may be nobody working on the Daily Telegraph ever goes to corner shops. I don't know, maybe Telegraph workers all have corner shops like from the sitcom, but this tends to be the angle that they see. So this doesn't match what their initial research identifies. They then go and explore and begin to critique hyperlocal spaces. So they say, well, local shops corner shops are discussed in localized hyperlocal spaces, such as this one, for example, for Southwest Birmingham. And they're interested because they're finding that actually a lot of discussion seems to be unmediated. There's a lot of people saying, yeah, packet of crisps has gone up 20p in my corner shop. It's an outrage. And the comments flow, and they see this as a potential concern. And they move from that to, so there's a danger in these hyperlocal media spaces to damage reputations. They move from that to drawing links to similar attitudes to ethnically owned corner shops internationally as well as the UK. So the research takes them to a kind of global perspective. So the corner shop being something that isn't completely common in all over the world, but is in an awful lot of parts of the world. So how is that being represented internationally? So this is their initial research. They then move on to make some key points, which are around the social, economic and cultural value of corner shops. They identify that during COVID, they play a key practical role in supporting local citizens, but also in maintaining positive community relations. And the students, through this kind of reflection, establish their own position, which then informs how they approach writing the story. So they're conscious they need to give a kind of both sides of the story in some regard, but they make visible their own position and where their views are weighted towards. They reach a point where they decide that corner shops are valuable. They're not necessarily overcharging, actually suppliers are overcharging them. But also what they rest on is this quite interesting critique, which is not only are hyperlocal spaces, in their view, a potential danger because they seem to be relatively unmediated, but also independent small shops lack the corporate buying power of communications. So here I've nicked this from an example of myself moaning to Sainsbury's at the weekend. It's not like I moaned to Sainsbury's deliberately to include it in this slide. I just spend my weekends moaning to Sainsbury's because what else are we going to do? But Sainsbury's jump on it, say, it's okay, Dave, it'll be fine. And the students here make a point that that is something that power to control reputation is lacking for corner shops, small businesses. And then they write a story, but actually we're not particularly interested in the story as such. It's written on the kind of hyperlocal site that the university runs, Birmingham East Side, and it's an absolutely sound story, well written, but we're less interested in that than all the stuff that comes before, where they get to this point, and then you know, having thought it through, having decided their own positions, having reflected on the issue, made global collections about this being an issue in other territories during COVID, then they write the story. So just to summarize what we've done in this presentation, we've tried to make a connection between the kind of strategic positions universities take on the local and global, and how that flows through to module design, but also the kind of contradictions that exist in the way in which journalism education is pitched to students. That actually critical thinking isn't foregrounded, it's somewhere someone tells you to write a critical reflection. But our playing out of that has been to foreground it in a module where we don't mark the journalism. What we try to do here is take a kind of non-normative approach to news days and to professional journalism norms, and drawn on what we might call a hyperlocal sensibility that foregrounds this critical reflection. Interestingly, of course, it doesn't always play out like that. And maybe there's the top assignments that realize they're just interested in the critical reflection. But even on this example, which was a high scoring example, they spend the last 8 so minutes of a 25-minute presentation talking about the ins and outs of how they got to the story, trying to get contributions, all that, because actually it can be difficult to push them to the reflection and emphasize that that's the thing we're interested in. And they very easily replicate practice norms and are really interested in the mechanics of doing the journalism. But this is an assessment that's trying to get them to think the other way. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Jerome. That was really interesting. I think it raised loads of interesting points. Can I just ask, and maybe this completely passed me by, the hyperlocal sites that they look at, are they being generated and judged on sort of a standards of the journalism in it, or just really the stories that they tell?
Well, it's quite a mixed economy. So I mean, that one, for example, is a well-established hyperlocal, independent hyperlocal site, which has a couple of different Facebook manifestations. It has its standard page, which we know through our own research, mine and Jerome, is very carefully maintained in terms of comments as much as they can. Then it has this subgroup that it's been running now for 9 months during COVID, and the students went there, and their immediate reaction seemed to be, this is like a shouting match. So they're bringing kind of normative journalistic expectations to these kind of spaces, and they're not distinguishing between even the Birmingham Mail Facebook COVID group, let's say, which, believe me, can be messy. As anybody who's looked at mainstream newspaper Facebook groups will know. This one, which is an independent one, or ones which are the wrong word, but my local one in Bourneville, which is a bun fest, it's all over the shop. So it's they don't make distinctions between that. They're bringing what they've learned, if you like, so far in their journalism education to this, and they're saying, hang on, this isn't like the journalism we understand from semester one. This is messy. So I mean, I think as you go up the levels to 5 and 6, you can then begin to nuance and take them through values of citizen participation in online spaces, and they can come to more nuanced reflections on it. But their immediate one is this ain't right.
It's good, really interesting. Thank you so much. Can I just firstly thank all of the speakers, and now we have probably 15-20 minutes that we could ask some questions if anybody has anything that they would like to. I mean, as usual, I could probably ask loads of questions, but I wouldn't hog the floor. Is there anybody who's got anything they would like to ask?
There was an interesting question from Gail earlier on. Gail, I don't know if you're wanting to come in on the call, or we could ask the question for you.
Yes, sorry, still here. Yeah, it was to our friend from Leeds Trinity. Yes, I was obviously very interested to hear how fabulous the great work that you did engaging audiences online. You know, you're talking about tens of thousands rather than the usual handful or a few hundreds that we might hope to achieve, you know, through our web output and our social media. But, you know, there's innovative ways and industry standard ways you know, piggybacking other big accounts, that kind of thing. But did it throw up any problems for you in terms of how you monitored responses? You mentioned, you know, big followings on YouTube, etc. Did you disable those functions, or did you take the risk of having, you know, people comment on your content and potentially run into problems legally, etc.?
With those students themselves, that they had actually started that account prior to the module, so it was something that it kind of, what they'd started off already then became what they did with that group. I did go through quite a lot of the comments, and they didn't, well, there wasn't anything that was a particular concern. I mean, I think it helps with covering sport rather than news, because a lot of the comments were kind of, because of the way that they were interacting, particularly on that live stream around the transfer deadline day, it was mostly people asking them, what about so-and-so and so-and-so club, and what's happening with this, as though they were kind of interacting with somebody on Sky Sports News. So it was more that kind of interaction rather than some of the probably more difficult interaction that you get with news. Because I think you can run into a lot more problems. I know that there are issues with sport and particular racism at the moment, but that wasn't something that they encountered in that situation. But
were you mindful of it though? Did you have some policy in place in case, you know, that happened? Because it, you know, obviously our professional colleagues in industry monitor what use output, don't they? Professional outsourced professional companies to make sure that anything like unsavory, you know, is taken down in an instant and has that 24-hour eyes on their output. So obviously you couldn't achieve that. Were you mindful of that? Did you worry about that? Did you have sort of anyone breathing down your neck about reputational damage and that sort of thing?
Not in this instance, because the students have done similar things to this in the past off their own back. So in a way, it's something that they've developed and they own. So although I'm working with them with this, and obviously it's something that we're working towards, it's their space. So I'm there to kind of help and try and work through them. And obviously if they're in a situation where they needed support, and obviously I'll look through all the content that goes out there, then I provide them with that. But equally, it's something that they went and decided to do. It wasn't something that had kind of been prearranged in that respect. So I mean, there is a danger of that. There is a danger of that. But I think if you're going to give the student, well, I mean, they would, if they're going to have the opportunity to do things, they kind of need the space to do that, I think, and then to go in to resolve some of those issues as they come along. But like I said, luckily with that, there wasn't any. But yeah, it is something that is always a concern.
I think it's a risk that we take, don't we? But trade-off is getting that real world learning, and it does inject more engagement, as you've described so well, and really enthuses them to produce content knowing that it's for a real audience. It just takes it up a notch, it takes it up a level. I've seen that myself in many other respects as well.
I think with that one particularly, because they were using YouTube live stream, it's not something that there is a lot of knowledge about in terms of lecturing staff anyway. It's not something that anybody's got a big background in, because it's a fairly new medium. But yeah, you would have to kind of, like you mentioned, apply the same standards that you would to everything else.
Well done, thank you.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Gail. Anything else? Kate, you've got a question?
Yes, thank you all for really interesting presentations. Enjoyed all of them. It's a question to David Harte, really, because we all know our students, well, hopefully it's not just mine, you know, you have to cajole them to even pick up the phone to ring someone to ask for interviews. How do they cope with actually being in a community hall and having to approach people to get their stories? A kind of confidence question, really.
Yeah, well, I wondered, Jerome, if you got examples when you went down to Sturchley to do your news day, you might be better placed on that.
Yeah, so the idea of it being week 5 is that, you know, almost from week 1, you're kind of ramping them up with the idea of, okay, week 5 is the day when we're going to go and do the newsroom, and you all need to have prepped your interviews and got in contact with the people beforehand and all of this. And of course, on the day, it doesn't quite play out like that, but it serves as quite a useful lesson about pre-planning and all of those kind of things. And so we were also dealing with the fact that COVID was just on the corner, around the corner. So I would have thought some of the people they might have been wanting to interview, well, it was slightly less possible. I'm just trying to think how many of them on the pop-up newsroom day actually did interviews. I would say maybe half the groups that attended that were doing that, and then the rest had to kind of mop up afterwards and find other ways of doing it. So, you know, as I say, there is a kind of lesson there about courtesy when organising things, and when you then can't do them and you have to cancel them, and letting people know you've cancelled them and you need to do them another time. And about the real, you know, as you say, the nuts and bolts and the practicalities of just picking up the phone or emailing somebody and getting in touch with them and all those kind of things.
And did you see their confidence grow afterwards? Was there a difference between them being actually out physically somewhere in the city rather than doing the journalism from the safety or sanctuary of the university?
I think they would, you know, those that arrived would definitely had more of a buzzy energy. One of the students walked all the way. Most of them got the bus. One of them walked all the way, which resulted in like a 30 to 40 minute walk, and I was quite excited by that. And so here, and because I'd said to them, as you're kind of travelling from where you are now to Sturchley, try and have a think about, you know, kind of identities of place and where you come from and where you're going to, and the difference in that, and how you communicate that in the piece of work, maybe, and how you reflect on that presentation. And it turned out he'd had his headphones on and just been in the music the whole time, and had not really kind of made that kind of reflective moment work, maybe. But they all turned up with a lot more energy than they would have done if they had just been doing it as a continuation of the desk research, I think. But also, as I say, like pop-up newsrooms often are associated with, you know, activism and being there to kind of take a local council to account or things like that. So there's a sense that applying it with something that's a bit more parochial is a little bit different. But they did, you know, walk up and down. A few of them did some vox pops actually with people at bus queues and things like that. So yeah, they would not have got that sense of place had they just been kind of still sat at desks, essentially.
The two who did the corner shop one obviously did it afterwards, because they talk in their presentation about a little bit about not being able, regretting not being able to stop people in the street to get and in fact they did they got the kind of vox pop stuff from posting a mini survey on one of the Facebook groups, to which they got a very poor response. But when they talking about that in presentation, I did think it sounds like they prefer stopping people in the street to even picking up the phone. So
yeah, it's interesting.
They must have done their assignment just slightly after we had to lock down.
I was just going to say that group, I think, I was quite impressed and surprised. They did actually manage to get some form of interview with a corner shop owner. I seem to remember.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Can I ask David and Agnes, the sort of a question I alluded to, when that sense of community and that sense of how you made some really interesting points around responsibility, and it made me think, is there a sense within a community whose responsibility it is to provide a space for a journalistic artifact output, or is there even, you know, a notion of, does a community have a sense that that a news, a website, a newspaper, a newsletter can actually be something that somebody does take responsibility for, and that actually plugs those sort of gaps of democratic accountability that we've lost because local papers have gone?
You're muted, David.
I'm muted. Sorry, sir. Agnes, do you want to pick up?
No, you used that. You go.
Oh, okay. Yes. Oddly, I mean, it sort of maps onto something I've been doing lately. A chapter for Rachel's book, Rachel Matthews. Nice. I see her.
Yes.
I see her attending there. Yes. I mean, looking at some sort of journalism startups that have happened since the global financial crisis, if you like, which I think might, which has sort of taken its toll on that. So, Hartlepool Life in northeast of England, and 3 ones in Scotland. There's a Howick paper in Howick. There's Jedi in Jedburgh, and there's the Estill and Liddesdale Advertiser, which was owned by Cumbria Newspapers, but was put up for sale and taken over by the local community. So in that one, it was a local business person who overheard someone talking in the corner shop that if the paper goes, it's going to be a disaster. So he thought, well, let's start up a community group to take it over. And in the other 3, it was journalists who were despairing at what had happened with the local papers, which were retreating from that locality, owned by the corporations, Johnson Press and the rest of it, and started them up. And I think so that in terms of that taking it over, and I think you also raised the question of thinking about community, and in many ways, I mean, Rachel and I have been doing some work on that as well. I'm picking up on the work of David Studdas and Valerie Walkerdine in social anthropologists at Cardiff. And they talk about community not as an object, a group of people who live in a particular place or whatever, but in terms of practice and processes and those interactions and interactivities that take place. I'm thinking of community as something you do rather than something you're part of. Mm-hmm. And that thinking of community as an object informs, if you like, the sort of classic business model of local and other media, where you take that object and flog them to the advertisers. Mm-hmm. As a commodity, and the thinking of community as a process brings in those sort of more nuanced things. And it's what Agnes was talking about in our presentation about theorizing mm-hmm. and the importance of doing that. And I think, and also it's allowed you to look at the value of local media, not just in terms of the information that's being put across, but all the processes that build into it. And I was thinking of that when David and Jerome were talking as well about those interactions and their interactivities and the getting in and talking to each other. Mm-hmm. So if a local newspaper goes, and it's something that Agnes was talking about, news gaps as well, mm-hmm. it's not just the information that's missing, it's also all those interactions. When the photographer goes to the local school to take the picture of the kids, when someone goes to the paper shop to buy a paper and talks to the person behind the counter or someone else in the shop, where the editor goes to the business lunch and talks about what the paper's doing in the place, the reporters to go out and speak to people, and all that fabric of community is taken away. Yeah. I think that. So yes, and also in advertising again, it's those small community businesses and startups and the things that David and Jerome were talking about, that where those practices of community happen. And the Hartlepool Life one that I looked at, it's on hold now because of the virus. But they were 18,000 copies were being picked up over 2 days in Hartlepool from all those little shops and businesses and things, and that was sparking those conversations and those discussions and the rest. So yes.
Thank you, David. Anybody else got any other questions? I'm really conscious of the time. How amazing would it be if AGE actually finished a conference on time? I've just seen Chris unmute his video, and I don't know if Chris, if you want to do your usual pitch in, give us some stuff for the journal. We have, I think,
just very quickly, if I can, Margaret, give us some stuff for the journal, particularly book reviews and anything else you think would be useful.
Yeah, I would completely concur with that. I think we mentioned this last week to colleagues as well, that, you know, Chris and Sally Ann, who are the journal editors, are here, as is Tor, who's our book editor. So, and obviously we have spoken about some new books today. So please do get in touch, either just with me and I'll pass it on to Chris, Sally Ann or Tor, or get in touch with them directly. Can I just say thank you so much to Agnes and David and Paul and Dave and Jerome for yet again really interesting papers. And thank you to those of you who've come along today. We have our third research seminar on the 3rd of March. And we have Ruth Stoker from Huddersfield, Ivana Abel and Gabrielle Brittlebrown from Derby, and John Price and Neil McFarlane from Sunderland. So we very much look forward to welcoming you there. If I will send an email out and clog up your email trays with details of how you can join us, but in effect it is the same Zoom as today's. So if you join today's, you have automatic entry for next time. So we do hope we can welcome you back. Before I finish, I just want to close by sharing with you news of our International Women's Day event, which we decided that we felt was something that we needed to do, and that quite possibly we should have done something in the past. But this year and the pandemic have made it so much easier. We know how difficult it would be for people to justify to their employers us getting together to celebrate something around International Women's Day. But this year, the very nature of the pandemic has made that possible. And so I'm really delighted to say that we have two, I think you'll agree, fantastic speakers for the event. Jane Garvey of Women's Hour, formerly of Women's Hour, and Terry White, who is editor-in-chief of Empire magazine, and who I'm sure lots of you know has just recently written an autobiography of her life thus far, which has received lots of coverage and lots of discussion. So we are really excited to have these two women coming to speak to us, and we very much hope that lots of you will take the opportunity to come and join us at the event. We will send details out tomorrow, probably first thing in the morning, depending on how well the rest of my evening goes and if I get the chance to get something put together. We, as I'm sure you've identified, we are only having 2 women speakers. The event will be chaired by one of the women on the AGE committee, but that does not mean that we're excluding men from the event, not at all. Nor that we won't let you ask questions, because of course we will. So we very much hope that this will be something that we can perhaps establish on an annual basis. And we very much hope as well that it can be perhaps the start of more events like this, short events whereby we just invite journalists, journalism educators to come and talk to us, you know, in quite sort of a manageable chunks of time, because we are very conscious that everyone's busy. So we're pretty excited about this. When both of our speakers confirmed at the end of last week, we were quite delighted and quite thrilled, and it took quite a lot of restraint on my part not to just go on the email and tell everybody. So I'm really delighted to be able to share that with you now, and I very much hope that we will see lots of you there on the 5th of March, and again that we'll see lots of you here on the 3rd of March for our third in our research seminar. And again, look out for our call for papers for this year's event, which will go out next week too. So a few emails heading your way from me, so I do apologise in advance, but I don't apologise for the fact that I think they're both fantastic events. So thank you so much. Again, thank you to our speakers, and very much look forward to seeing everybody next time. Thank you. And we will, of course, this will be recorded. We will put it on the website. So it will be available in the next few days for anybody who would like to watch it. So thank you. Thanks, folks. If anybody wants to stay on for chat, then I'm quite happy to be distracted from work for the next 5 or 10 minutes, because I've got quite a lot still to do before the day ends. Sally Ann, you sent me something. Oh, you've gone. Thank you, Kate, for doing the tweeting. David, that was good. I enjoyed that. I don't know if everybody else is here. Kathy Watson, can you unmute your video? Or unmute your mic?
If you stop sharing the slides, Margaret, we can see you still on. There we go. There's a few of us.
We stop recording as well.
Oh yes.
Have to clean up. Well, can I just